This video is all about how to design plantings for sloping and hillside landscapes. This is the third video in a series of videos, but it is okay if you're watching them out of order. But I do recommend, if you haven't already, check out the previous video, the second video in this series as well, because it's all about how to stabilize plantings on slopes. These two videos really go together. There is a link to this whole playlist in the description below, so you don't have to search around for the different videos in this series. I've got lots of resources about landscaping on slopes to help you prepare for your project. Generally, the best garden beds or plantings for stabilizing slopes are planted densely, so no gaps where soil or mulch can erode away. They are planted in layers and include a diversity of different plant types and species with different characteristics and different root systems. And of course, the plants you use should be well suited to your climate and the growing conditions of the space. When I recommend planting densely or planting in layers, some people start to worry that this means their hillside landscape has to look messy. But this is where good design comes in. A dense planting with multiple layers could be all shorter plantings, but you still should have a diversity of different plant types, characteristics. Some ground covers, some things that grow a little bit more upright, maybe some dwarf shrubs that are going to have different root systems. You can have a diversity of interesting colors, textures, different bloom times, and still enough repetition in the landscape to tie everything together and create a sense of cohesion. Planting densely means that the plants should overlap slightly at maturity. And you can look up the mature size of a plant online or in a good garden guide. The amount of overlap depends if you're planting things in layers. Sometimes things can overlap a little bit more or even be planted underneath another plant. If you have a tree and then you have an understory shrub, for example, things can be closer together. But if you have plants that are similar layer or similar plant type, I like to say elbow to elbow or just a little bit of overlap. The more plants you have in the landscape, within reason of course, the more you're going to stabilize your soil. So go as dense as you can. And please note that planting densely does not necessarily mean that your landscape has to be an overwhelming jungle or a thick forest of plantings. You can plant shorter plantings densely. The goal is to have a diversity of things, of course, and to not have any exposed soil or exposed mulch, because plants are going to be holding these materials in place. Eventually, these materials can just erode away just because of normal rainfall. The goal is just to not have any exposed mulch or soil once the plants fill in. This also leads to a lower maintenance landscape, because the more plants you have to fill in the space, the less you need to mulch and the less you need to weed. When planting layers of plantings, this can include ground covers, herbaceous perennials, small shrubs, small trees, large trees, and so on. There are different definitions of the different layers and sub-layers within that, but those are sort of the main categories. We've got ground covers, herbaceous perennials, shrubs, and trees. I recommend going as large as you can. Plant the largest thing you have this space for, but you can of course have waves of plantings and various heights mixed in. Diversity is key. And the larger the plant, generally the more roots it has, and the more it's going to be stabilizing your hillside. Now I want to talk about ground cover plants for a bit specifically. When someone says ground cover plant, this is typically referring to plants that are low growing, horizontally growing or trailing, and that cover the soil. Their roots are typically more shallow and fibrous. Some ground cover plants are just shorter plants, but many ground cover plants have this habit where they tend to grow and then root and then grow and then root. And for all of these reasons, ground covers are great at anchoring the mulch in the first few inches of soil in place. A common piece of advice given frequently to those landscaping on slopes is to plant ground covers, because ground covers are great for slopes. And this is true, they are great for slopes, but this is incomplete advice, or it's often presented as incomplete advice. I say that this advice to plant ground covers is incomplete advice because you probably want to anchor more than just the mulch in the first few inches of soil in place. You want more than that to be secure. A common interpretation of this advice is to plant an entire hillside in ground covers, and sometimes even just in one species of one type of ground cover. And if this one plant's root system is too shallow for the needs of the space, you might still have erosion problems. Imagine spreading a layer of glue over the side of a sand dune, and this is like planting ground covers, right? It's going to create this solid mass, but that entire mass can still slide down if conditions are right. In summary, ground covers are great because we do want to secure some of that mulch in the first few inches of soil in place, but we also want other plant types. Plant different layers, plant densely, and make sure you end up with a diversity of different things so you have these different root systems that are going to do different things and work together to anchor your hillside in place. If you're starting to worry about the number of plants that you will need to plant densely and plant in layers on your hillside, then my recommendation is to plant all or as many native plants as you can. You can do a mix of native and non-native, of course, but native plants tend to be more affordable and sometimes are significantly more affordable. I do think that there's a bit of a misconception that native plants are less attractive or less appealing than other plants. So here are a few examples. I'll put some pictures up of some native plants that grow in my area. And as you can clearly see, these plants really can hold their own. I bet if you saw an ad for one of these plants in a gardening magazine or online, that you would be looking at them. You would be interested. I'm willing to bet that there's more native plant options out there than you know. I'm sure you've heard the spiel about native plants before, but they tend to be lower maintenance than other plants because they are adapted to your local soils, to your local climate, your weather patterns. They tend to be more affordable as well. And not to mention, they support all kinds of living creatures. A lot of native plants, what you're doing by planting natives is you're supporting native insects that otherwise do not have a place to live right now because there used to be native plants where your house is, more than likely, and now there are not. By putting native plants back into this space, you're creating habitat for the insects. These insects tend to be the bottom of the food chain, so birds tend to feed insects to their young. And so as you can see, planting native plants, just the presence of these plants can have positive effects all the way up the food chain. And it's less work for you and it saves money. I'm willing to bet that there are nurseries, groups, organizations in your area that can help connect you to native plants that will be more affordable than conventional landscaping plants. You can often get a discounted rate if you order plants in bulk as well. So reach out to your gardening friends, local gardening groups. I always recommend all or as many native plants as possible in any landscape, but especially on hillsides, because first, the whole plant budget thing, we need to be planting densely and planting a diversity of things. And then the other part of it is native plants are less maintenance. It's steep, you don't want to be out there taking care of things. So plant as many natives as you can and let them do their thing. Now let's talk inspiration or how to quickly find plants that are going to be a good fit for a hillside in your area. First, I recommend starting with local ecosystem inspiration. As local as possible, learn about the native plant communities that thrive on slopes in your area. And in all seriousness, if you are able, I recommend you actually go out and visit one of these spaces where these plants grow. Start with the big picture and notice any similarities or what can apply to the space that you are landscaping and just see what you can learn. So maybe you can learn what native plant species grow in similar conditions that'll work well in your yard as well. See what plants grow together too. How many different layers can you see? What do the layers look like? What are the different characteristics of each layer? And how do the different species work together to stabilize slopes? You can then go on to learn how to establish a similar plant community in your landscaping. Whether you're planting native plants or not, this is still a fantastic way to learn how to establish a successful plant community in your landscaping. If you're substituting non-native plants, then consider plants with complementary characteristics, things that are going to collaborate well with other plants or just fill a similar niche in that space, and don't be afraid to experiment. You can also collect inspiration from neighbors and other nearby landscapes. This is a great way to learn what will likely do well in your yard, but please do not be limited by what you see. This should not be your only source of inspiration. Please remember that many urban, suburban landscapes only scratch the surface of what's actually possible. But it can be really helpful to see what species are thriving in similar spaces. Every yard is different, but if something is thriving just next door, there's a pretty good chance that it will also thrive in your space. Go on a walk and collect bits and pieces of inspiration. Politely take pictures of plants in neighbors' yards, and then you can have them identified. I've got a whole video where I talk about that. I'll link to that in the corner of this video right now, as well as in the description below. As much as I absolutely love looking at pictures in gardening magazines and books and online, nothing beats this opportunity to learn what's actually thriving in your area. If you would like help researching and selecting specific plants for your landscape, I have a free mini course all about this. It's called How to Choose the Perfect Plant. So instead of relying on other outside sources to make recommendations for what will work in your space, it teaches you how to evaluate your space, how to make a checklist of the characteristics you should consider in a plant possibility, where to go to research plants and narrow down your options so you can make a good selection that has the best chance of being successful in your space. Again, this is a free resource. All you need to do is create a username and a password so you can keep track of your progress as you move through the course. It's about an hour long total. You can skip to the parts that are most relevant. I hope it helps you. I hope it helps you learn. So from here on, you can know how to determine if a plant is a good fit for your space. Another tip when designing a garden in a steep space is to avoid the more top-heavy blooming herbaceous perennials. So a delphinium is an example of something that's very popular, that's a little bit more top-heavy, and if it's in a windy area, you may need to stake it. So you can use these plants, but just plan to incorporate more staking and trellising in the space. In my opinion, it's a lot of work to be out in a steep space, tying things up as they're about to bloom. So you could just use them along the edges of the space, or again, there's thousands of beautiful, not top-heavy plant options out there. Next, pay extra close attention to mature plant height when designing these spaces on slopes. It's very common in garden bed design to put the taller plants toward the back or the taller plants toward the center of the garden bed. This can work in sloped spaces, but you just have to keep in mind whatever you're placing in that space is going to be elevated by the slope itself. So just think carefully about who is going to be blocking who and how big everything is going to get based on where it's placed on the slope. If you're not sure how to approach this, an easy way to start is to think about a view from somewhere you're going to be spending a lot of time looking at the landscape and design something beautiful from that vantage point. And slopes have many more interesting angles from which you can view the landscape. Sometimes you'll be looking downhill into a sea of plantings, or maybe uphill where everything's on display. You can also think about the views or the experience of the pathways that meander through the space from different points. So think about your plant height. For example, from a pathway, maybe you want lower plants along that pathway so you can see out into the landscape more. Or perhaps you want taller plants so it's like a secret garden sort of journey from one space to another. If you would like more help creating a plan for your whole landscape, I have a course, Design Your Own Landscape Layout, where I guide you step by step through the process of creating a hand-drawn, to-scale landscape design layout plan. So it's a plan, just an overview of the project, so you can break that down into steps for installation. You don't need fancy software and you don't need artistic skills. It's all about creating just a rough, hand-drawn plan of what will go where. To learn more about this course, I've got a link in the description below, or you can email me at hello@gardenprojectacademy.com. The whole playlist about landscaping on a slope is also linked in the description below, so you can see all of the other resources I've got. Jump to another video. Again, if you haven't seen the previous video all about how to stabilize your plantings on a slope, I'll make sure that pops up right here at the end of this video. I have to put this disclaimer out there. I am a landscape designer, but I am not your landscape designer. Best practices can be different everywhere. They can even vary from yard to yard, so be sure to reach out to additional, ideally local expertise, learn more, do additional research. Always up to you to decide what's best for you and your yard. Thank you so much for watching, and happy gardening.